So it would seem that Morning Joe has recently decided to end their Bernie blackout, airing a segment discussing the Vermont senator's chances of winning the nomination, and it is so close, yet so far. Let's take a look.
Let's move along. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign seems to be catching the attention, at least of some Democratic insiders, finally, as some new reports highlight his potential to win the party's nomination. Politico reporting that over the past few weeks, Democratic officials, political operatives, and pundits have reconsidered Sanders' chances in 2020. They point to Senator Elizabeth Warren's recent slide in the polls, as well as Senator Sanders enduring the ups and downs of the primary race, including his bounce back after a heart attack in October, while other candidates have either dropped out or are polling in single digits. The Politico piece points to the latest CNN SSRS poll, which shows Sanders has the highest net favorability rating of any Democratic presidential candidate. And the New York Times is up with a story pointing out that with less than 6 weeks until voting begins now, Sanders sits at the top of the polls in Iowa and other early voting states. When these polls come up seemingly every morning, and we might talk about Mayor Pete's rise or how Joe Biden has stabilized, Bernie Sanders every time. Talk about durability in Joe Biden. How about Bernie Sanders? Hangs out right there in that second slot, right around where Joe Biden is, and increasingly distancing himself from Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, in addition to the word durability, underline it next to Bernie Sanders, you can also underline consistency, and you can underline predictability and loyalty. All of his followers, they have been with him for many, many years. They didn't just sort of jump on the Sanders train a few months ago. They have been with him for many, many years, even prior to his announced run for the presidency. And the survival factor here, including the heart attack, is absolutely amazing.
But on Bernie, he's remained very resilient, and that's a reflection of the fact that his followers are very loyal. It's a reflection of the fact that Elizabeth Warren has stumbled, and that is a portion of the vote that may start to consolidate around Bernie, but it's also a reflection of the fact that he hasn't come under the same type of withering scrutiny and criticism that some of these other candidates have, like Joe Biden and like Elizabeth Warren. So the next thing I'm going to be watching for is whether those gloves do come off with Bernie Sanders on his record of accomplishment in the Senate, because while he has been consistent over a lifetime on his issues, and that's why his supporters love him and view him as very genuine, at the same time, the reality is that because of the way the Senate operates and the fact that there is unlikely to be a huge blowout that massively shifts the balance of power, even if Democrats do gain control, it will make it very hard for him to get some of his marquee promises through the Senate. And so let's see if he comes under that type of criticism from Joe Biden, asking him, hey, Bernie, I served with you in the Senate. Which one of these things that you have been pushing for 20, 30 years have you actually gotten through the Senate? That is where that line of attack will come if we see it. And that will definitely happen if these numbers continue to consolidate.
So before I get to her comments, get to Heidi's comments there at the end, let me just take this whole thing in order. So you saw there at the beginning, they were talking about a bunch of articles that came out over the past few days from like Politico, New York Times, talking about Democratic insiders and how they're suddenly shocked. Oh my goodness, Bernie Sanders actually has a serious chance of winning. How could this happen? What is going on? How could Bernie Sanders have won? Who saw this coming? Nobody saw this coming. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. I remember when these articles were coming out, I remember I was laying in bed, about to go to bed. I was, sort of flipping through, reading the articles, and I remember just being like, what? Closed them out, put them down, had to go to bed because they are absolutely ridiculous. I mean, look, where have you been? It's like where have you been for the past like year, essentially past year? Look, back in September, Bernie Sanders passed 1 million individual donors. 1 million people, literally 1 million people have given to his campaign. Now it's way more. And now Bernie Sanders is about to pass 5 million individual contributions. That's insane. That is way more than any candidate at this point in American history. I mean, it is absolutely insane. Bernie Sanders has the most volunteers. He has absolutely the most grassroots support. In fact, one example of that, I recently was reading an article. Apparently, Bernie Sanders has has more grassroots support, more fundraising relative compared to Biden in swing counties, swing districts, which flipped from Obama to Trump. In other words, what does that mean? Bernie Sanders has grassroots support where it matters, where it counts. Bernie Sanders has the most grassroots support. And look, I was reading some articles and watching some videos about this, and there's generally like two sort of theories on the left which I've seen about why these articles are suddenly getting published. One is sort of just, look, these journalists don't want to be wrong in the same way that they were wrong about Donald Trump, so they want to put these articles out there so that then if Bernie does win, they could be like, what, me? No, look at this article I wrote 6 months ago. I totally saw this coming, totally knew that this was going to happen. I had my crystal ball. I knew that this was going to happen. And then the other theory is kind of just like, you can read these as warning shots that now the establishment and, corporate Democrats, etc., are well aware that Bernie has a chance to win, and so now they're going to start attacking him a lot more, as was previewed by Heidi there at at the end there. Now, I will say some of this also why these Democratic insiders seem to just now be coming around to it. It's not that they actually didn't know. It's that, look, they have no incentive at all for Bernie to win, because look, you think about it, a lot of these jobs are tied up with having connections with the right people. But Bernie Sanders represents an entirely new, like, if Bernie Sanders wins, the Democratic Party is changed in the way that a lot of Republicans feared that Donald Trump would do to the Republican Party. Like, if Bernie Sanders wins this thing, the kinds of people that you need to know in order to get connections, in order to be a good strategist, in order even to be a good journalist and good reporter, you need to know different people. You need to know these on the ground activists who you don't have connections with right now. And so if you're if your level is up here right now, in terms of being a Democratic insider, it's going to be down here with Bernie Sanders if you still have a job. And so, for a lot of these people, it can even just be kind of pure ambition, right? Like, in terms of, my status that I'm at right now will drop if Bernie Sanders wins. And don't underestimate status. A lot of people really care about status, especially in Washington. But now let me talk a little bit about Heidi's comments there at the end. So she essentially says that Bernie's plans are unlikely to pass, and you can look at Bernie's history in the Senate or whatever. And so that'll be like a line of criticism which you can make against, because Republicans aren't going to work with Bernie. And so this is like a serious line of attack which you can use against Bernie. Now, I don't doubt that that's a line of attack which we're going to see, but let me tell you. So look, I was on the debate team when I was in college, and one of the lines of criticism which we could use against opponents was called uniqueness. What is uniqueness? So uniqueness arguments can be used in debate when, here's the stock example. So the stock example is, the schoolyard bully comes to you and says, give me your lunch money or I'm going to punch you. And maybe you do a couple times, but then you come to realize that whether or not you give him the lunch money, he punches you anyway. In that case, the bully's argument for giving you giving the lunch money has no uniqueness, because there's no unique reason why you should give the lunch money, because the guy's going to punch you anyway. Same thing applies here. If I was arguing with Heidi there, I would say, look, your argument has no uniqueness, because whether or not you're a centrist like Joe Biden, for instance, trying to get something passed, Republicans aren't going to work with you anyway. Look at Obamacare, for instance. Obama came in initially saying that he was going to do a public option. He does all kinds of weird compromises, and they get, this basically Republican plan, a plan which was initially thought up in, essentially, I believe, the Heritage Foundation, right? And so, they passed this plan, and no Republicans vote for it. So they start off super, super compromised, and Republicans aren't going to work with you anyway. And so you wonder, right? It's like, if they're not going to work with you anyway, then why not just say what you actually believe in? Or why not just propose something which is really, really left and at least be able to shift the Overton window? So I see no reason to think that Republicans are going to be any more likely to work with Joe Biden or a Pete Buttigieg or a more centrist candidate, because they're just not, like, there's no incentive to do that. Why? But that does raise an interesting question. Why isn't there any actual incentive to compromise? Well, some of this has to do with the fact that, look, if you give the president a win, or the party in power a win, then that and and voters generally like it, or it's something good, then they're just going to vote down ballot against all the Republicans. So if a Democrat is in office and they get any kind of healthcare reform through, even if it's something that you and I, like as progressives, we might not agree with. Let's say that it's like a couple minor expansions to Obamacare, which actually, to be clear, it's not that like we disagree with that. It's just that we support Medicare for all, or at least I support Medicare for all single payer, and so that's different than so, a more moderate change. But let's say that we do get like a very that a Joe Biden wins or something, and then he passes these very moderate expansions to Obamacare or something. Republicans still aren't going to support that because voters are going to see that, and it's going to be basically a win for the Democratic president. And a lot of voters are probably going to like it, even if we could have done better. And they're still going to vote against Republicans down ballot. And so Republicans in Congress know this, and so they know to oppose anything that the Democratic president gets through, because it's just going to like they'll just be down ballot damage. There is no incentive to compromise in a system where there's two major parties, because if one party wins, if one party gets a win, then voters turn around, even if it's like unrelated, you're voting down ballot in a state legislator, you're still going to then be like, oh, well, I like the Democratic Party now. And so you vote for the person with the D in their name in the state legislator. And so there's absolutely no incentive in our structure. There's no incentives built into our structure for state representatives really to compromise on anything, or even to work with the other party, because if you work with the other party, you give the other party a win. And if you give the other party a win, then voters just are going to, if they like that win, then they're going to vote for that party more. And so, there's just no incentive built into our structure to win. And so that's why I don't think that Heidi's argument has any uniqueness. So anyway, anyway, that's the video. Morning Joe, so close yet so far. If you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.